welcome to our latest installment of The Black Table here on the Black Star Network. My name is Greg Carr, and I'm honored to serve as the host every week. And this week, we are having a conversation with one of our great scholars, warriors, organizers, a man that Cornel West has called the towering radical theorist of American democracy of his generation. And in this case, I would fully agree. This brother that we're about to hear from, Professor Adolph Reed, is a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. That was his latest stop in a long career. He's taught at the New School. He's taught at the University of Illinois, Chicago, Northwestern, Yale, and at Howard University, among other places. He's won a number of awards as the publisher and has published 7 books, and several of them I keep near me, Stearns and the Jug, W.B. Du Bois, American Political Thought, Class Notes. Those 2 of those are collections of his essays. He wrote one of the first books on Jesse Jackson, if not the first. We'll ask him in a second in terms of his political campaigns. And equally, if not more importantly, he is an organizer, an activist. We've talked over the following few weeks to Robert Smith and Abdullah Kalamat. Well, like them, Adolph Reed has been in the trenches and grappling with the real issues that will help us transform our society. His latest book, the book we'll be discussing today, is The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives. He is a Southerner, New Orleansian, although he's got roots in Arkansas, has spent time in Georgia, North Carolina, many other places. And we're going to talk about all that and more now with our guest here at the Black Table, Professor Adolph Reed Jr. Welcome, Professor Reed. How are you?
Oh, good. Yeah, good, brother. Thanks a lot for having me, man. I appreciate it. And I thought I saw Stearns and the Jug on the shelf behind you, but I didn't want to be too arrogant.
Oh, yeah. No, man. Oh, yes. No. Look, I didn't realize, and of course, you mentioned your dear friend and another great force who we lost too soon, Joe Wood.
Yeah.
And it took him 2 years to coax you into writing What Are the Drums Saying book. I remember reading that in the Village Voice, and those shots fired still reverberate, brother. You get still stung by that, man. I'm glad Cornell got over it.
Hey, man, like I've got so much respect for that brother, man. I mean, like we have worked very closely together, especially through the 2 Sanders campaigns, and he's like a stalwart comrade and more than one of the most important things I think I can say about anybody is that he's clearly politically serious. And there are fewer and fewer of those folks out there, right? Even when they think they are, they aren't. So
it's funny. I planned on asking you this later, but actually since in the flow of conversation, it works quite well. The young cat that wrote the profile, a bit of a profile on you and a bit of a review on the book in the New Yorker in January. He quoted Cornell as saying that you have these great contempts for structural inequality and hypercapitalism and how these things operate, and people misinterpret perhaps sometimes your very keen and precise, really, critique of how race operates in this society. I think about, of course, your colleague Barbara Fields, who wrote the foreword to The South. But make no mistake about it, you detest inequality in all its forms, particularly structural inequalities. And it seems to me, I guess the first question I would ask before we get to the book, well, I guess it actually dovetails with the book. Where does that come from? You come from a long line of folks who have pushed against barriers. And we were talking about your father and your mother as well. But please say something about your origins.
Well, yeah, it's funny, man. I mean, like one of my personal mantras, maybe my personal motto is that it's most often better to be in the right place at the right time to pay attention than it is to be smart, right? And that's the response that I have whenever somebody says I was prescient for observing Obama and the way I observed him. I was just there, right? I was in the birthing room at the outset of his political career, so to speak, and was involved in the controversy. So, but I say that to say, back when I was a youngster, as you know, there was a certain cachet that attached to the persona of the red diaper baby back in the 60s. But I always felt like I just inherited the family business, right? I mean, because my dad, right, was immersed in and came out of that sort of Black Popular Front leftism from the 30s and 40s. And his father in like Southeast Arkansas was actually a Debs voter and a socialist. And
Gene Debs.
Yep. So, and I think like there was like a handful of Debs voters in Arkansas in the 1912 election. And his father was one of them, and Orville Faubus's father was another.
Wow! Oh yeah, you really disrupting narratives at this. This is before Moore versus Dempsey. I think about all my.
Oh yeah, that's right.
These cats want to talk about Scipio Jones and them boys. He's like, no, race is not that easily read. You have to read it against class. Fascinating. Yeah. So you did inherit the family business, and I asked you before we started about not only your father's work, but the impact of that generation of historically Black college professors, particularly political scientists. Who, could you talk about
well, Southern University in particular, right, in the late 50s and the beginning of the 60s, they had a really extraordinary complement of faculty, like in history and political science. The two departments were combined. And that's one of the reasons that Atlanta University, where I went to graduate school, was I wouldn't say dominated, but there was a prominent line among the faculty and the students that came through Southern. Right, Mac Jones, the department chair, is also from Southwest Louisiana and was expelled from Southern in 1960 in the student demonstrations, and went to Texas Southern. Alex Willingham was from Shreveport, went to Southern. When he finished his PhD, went back and taught at Southern, and then came to AU. And those are the people who recruited me to go to AU, right? And Shelby Lewis. It's from Plain Dealings, Louisiana, up there, not too, someplace between Shreveport and Ruston. And she taught at Southern, or she went to Southern, and she came and she taught African politics at AU, and we had a bunch of students, right? I mean, my closest comrade in like every student class for several years had somebody like me in it, at least one such person who had come back to graduate school from having been out organizing, right?
Yes.
And my, one of my closest comrades, I'd really say my closest comrade in the graduate program is my homeboy, who also happens to be from New Orleans, Earl Picard, who was a year after me. And so for a while there, the leadership of the Atlanta chapter of the African Liberation Support Committee was made up, concentrated largely among a group of people who were graduate students in the AU political science program. And in fact, one especially telling moment was several of us were enrolled in a Marxist theory seminar that Alex taught in the fall of 1973. It was my second year and Earl's first. And as the semester began, we were confronted with the coup against the Allende government in Chile. And this was at the same time that we were struggling for a left position within the Atlanta ALSC chapter, and coming up on the 1973 mayoral election in Atlanta, which would produce Maynard Jackson, the city's first Black mayor. So it was like once again, I go back to the motto, right? It was quite important for me to be in the right place at the right time and pay attention.
That's remarkable, and we actually, as I said, we talked to Abdul, Professor Kalamat. His new book on the Liberation Support Committee is out now, and I don't know how you managed to pack all this in 140 plus pages in this book. But I mean, there are references to the Republic of New Africa, to the Garvey movement, and you actually, having lived through those moments in the 60s and 70s, coming of age intellectually, and being involved, you have a unique perspective. And we'll get more into this in the next segment, but the book, which I think you, of course, rightly bristle at calling it a memoir, but you do.
Thank you, brother.
You do use your life as a Southerner who is well-traveled and circled through these movements to kind of give unique perspective. Could you give us a sense of what it was like growing up in New Orleans. And we'll come back after the break and talk about this much more. But you didn't just grow up in New Orleans, huh? You New Yorker.
Right. Well, and so in a way, I think all that kind of helped because, like, yeah, I mean, moving around a lot wasn't fun at the time as a kid, of course, but I realized, like, in retrospect, like not having come up in any one place, like the rules of the game, right, of hierarchy and exploitation were never really second nature. I was always kind of learning right what the local options were. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, as you well know, like the circumstances that you grow up in are always going to be somewhat like nature. I mean, for instance, somebody asked me in another interview not that long ago whether there's an incident that I mentioned in the book where my grandmother, like when I was a little kid, I used to love to ride the Algiers ferry back and forth across the river. And my grandmother and I were on it one day. I was like 5, 6, 7, something like that. And we sat close to the dividing line, the Jim Crow dividing line on the ferry. And I asked her, what was up with the chicken wire? And she said in a stage whisper, well, a lot of crazy people ride the ferry and they have to sit on the other side of the chicken wire. So, that made sense to me. And I was glad that they had to sit over there. But somebody asked me, not that long ago, if I noticed that all the people on the other side of the chicken wire were white. And fact is, no, I didn't, right? I just knew they were crazy people, right?
That is hilarious. It's so funny because even as you open the text, man, the way that not only your grandmother and your family, but Black folk in the Black community, and the way that you, disassemble this notion that race is somehow real, but rather it's socially constructed. The way that y'all navigated those lines, not only did it feel familiar to me as someone born and raised in Tennessee, who's in that generation that comes after you all, and kind of received that kind of, our parents grew up in the lost cause mentality South, but it was very familiar because it's not that simple as black and white.
Right.
Was this the same grandmother y'all sent in to get the beignets, man?
Absolutely.
And any Southerner understands what you were writing there. It's not just black and white.
Oh, good. I hope so. Yeah, I definitely hope so.
Yeah.
Right.
When we come back, we're going to take a minute pause, and when we come back, we actually are going to go right to your book, The South, and we can talk more and really get into this whole complexities of race and class. Through the lens of someone who is in a generation, which is in many ways the last generation to have directly experienced that form of American apartheid we call Jim Crow. So back with the Black Table in a moment.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jackie Hood Martin, and I have a question for you. Ever feel as if your life is teetering and the weight and pressure of the world is consistently on your shoulders? Well, let me tell you, living a balanced life isn't easy. Join me each Tuesday on Black Star Network for A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie. We'll laugh together, cry together, pull ourselves together, and cheer each other on. So join me for new shows each Tuesday on Black Star Network, A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie.
Back at the Black Table with Professor Adolph Reed, Professor Emeritus, University of Pennsylvania, and author of the new book, The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives. When we left, we were right on the verge of beginning to plumb the depths of this book. In the first chapter, Quotidian Life in the 1950s and 60s, and chapter 2, The Order in Flux and Being in Flux Within the Order. Prof, help us understand what you mean when you help us understand. Well, you say two things. One, you're in that generation, of course, who experienced Jim Crow, and you say it's the last generation. And by the way, I'm glad that y'all are long-lived. Your mom, that's great to hear, man. But I mean, help us understand in a world where we often see too many times things as black and white in terms of race,
right.
What those complexities look like growing up for you and traveling around.
Well, yeah. It's kind of hard to do it like in a nutshell because, like I said, I mean, the when you're experiencing it, like it's just life, right?
Yes.
So it's only, with the benefit of hindsight, right, that you can begin like to order it, right, right into categories. And I mean, like if you come up with the understanding of a hierarchy, then the hierarchy is like nature. But people also kind of look for, dignity and decency and security in their lives, no matter what. But I think one of the differences now that doesn't help us, and I know that this person is like going to be just probably tired of my using this anecdote, but a couple of years before I retired, I did a course, a grad seminar on Black American political thought. And it was really more of a reading course or a bibliographical course than it was a research course. So the readings were impossibly heavy. And students led discussions every week about that week's readings. And there's one student who was a first-year student in political philosophy whose background wasn't part of this stuff at all, led the discussion of a mass of readings from the mid-30s to the late 40s, and people like Ralph Bunche, Oliver Cox, a big chunk of Rayford Logan's collection, What the Negro Wants, a bunch of other stuff, articles from the Journal of Negro Education, a lot of other stuff. And she began by saying, the thing that really surprised me about all these readings was nobody actually talked about the need to fight racism. They all talked about, specific policies and proposals that we needed to fight for and ones that we needed to fight against, but nobody was talking about fighting an abstraction called racism. And one of the things that's happened to us since in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act and with the sort of change in Black American politics since then, is that the way we think about and talk about politics has moved farther and farther away from concrete objectives and issues and policies, and more to abstractions like racism, white supremacy, or trans-historical anti-Blackness or whatever. Mm-hmm. So from that perspective, and I mean, I often invoke the metaphor of an aerial photo lens, right? So like the higher you pull the lens up right into the air, the more everything on the ground looks the same, right? But the closer you come to Earth, the more able you are to see the distinctions, right? About the mountains, the valleys, the deserts, right? Whatever. Yes. And to the extent that our the dominant ways of thinking and talking about politics among Black Americans have climbed up to that level of abstraction that they've climbed up to, then it does create a picture in which everything seems the same. Nothing has changed, right? Because insofar as racism is an attitude, well, the attitude is going to be around, right? Yes. And that helps, I think, to make sense of the manifestly wrong-headed or problematic notion that nothing has changed for Black people since, 1965, 1865, 1765, 1619. Yeah. Right. When it's patently obvious, most directly in the biographies and occupations of the people making the charge, that a whole lot of stuff has changed, and has changed pretty radically. So I guess I should apologize, man, because I think I might have taken us on what my grandmother used to describe as going all around Robin Hood's barn, and I'm not sure that I answered your question correctly.
No, not at all. Not at all, Prof. Okay. Actually, that's actually very good. And I'm glad, because one of the things we're doing here is exposing folks to things they might not hear in other venues. And by evoking those Black writers in particular from the 30s and 40s, and of course, shout out to Charles Thompson, the editor, and all those folks at the Journal of Negro Education. Of course, those just exquisite work, as you know better than I do. It raises two questions that really emerge, that are teased through in the book. One, when you say separate was never intended to be equal.
Mm-hmm.
So, those who might romanticize and say, well, we had to get, I remember the conversation you had with the white patron, y'all in the hotel where you wouldn't have gone in before, and he's talking about the good old days. And you say, I'm not going to say anything. I just want to get my po' boys out of here. But on the other end of the spectrum, which is fascinating, you say that, oppressed people know it. So the idea of devaluing the poor, and I guess in what you just laid out for us, some of those things kind of converge. They might not have written about race overtly. Oliver Cox, another HBCU towering figure, of course, Ralph Bunche and all of those folks. At the same time, I wonder, the folks who say perhaps that nothing has changed or that things that have changed haven't made that big of a difference. How do you think about the power of Black institutions during this period of Jim Crow, realizing, as you say in the book, that one of the things segregation did was prevent the full maturation of that kind of class stratification that since 1965 we've seen just really jump. Right. But it maybe is part of this assertion that things haven't changed as a result of folks who find themselves in different institutional formations or class arrangements than their predecessors. I don't know. I mean,
yeah, that's an interesting question too. Like, I wonder about that. Sometimes like in an autobiographical way, like if I'd gone to school someplace else, right, with the opportunity structures that were opening, like if I would have been, John McWhorter's daddy or something like that, right?
Right.
But I don't know. Right.
Y'all had at Atlanta University, man, with Mac Jones and them. In fact, we just talked to Robert Smith, who just did.
Oh yeah, right.
Yep. I mean, I'm trying to imagine what that would look like now.
Well, see, I'll tell you something else about that though, too. Like, as important as AU was for me, UNC Chapel Hill was just as important, right?
And I saw you dedicated it to Earl Indris Thorpe, man.
Yeah.
Earl Thorpe, man. Yeah. That's a name we don't hear much. Right?
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and he was a longtime family friend, man. He was part of that group at Southern, too.
Oh, you know what? Right. It wasn't the Du Bois book. It wasn't the South. It was maybe one of the
other. Yeah. Right. That's right. It was the Du Bois book. And he was an intellectual historian, and he and people like Samuel Du Bois Cook gave money to defense funds to keep me from going to jail. So that was great.
But I didn't mean to take you away from. So you say UNC was just as important as AU?
Well, yeah, because the moment that I went there was like a moment in the midst of campus ferment, right? It was just before it was in that instant, like between the free speech or the anti-speaker ban movement and the civil rights protests in Chapel Hill, and the emergence of the anti-war movement, right? So I was there just at the beginning of that. I was part of the group that sort of took over the campus NAACP chapter and rechristened it the Black student movement. But this was also a period in North Carolina when, because of the North Carolina Fund, which was the only one of the Ford Foundation's 13, I think, gray areas projects that was not in a big city. The North Carolina Fund funded community-based organizing of poor people in the state of North Carolina. And in the late 60s, I think North Carolina was probably the most organized state in the country like that. We had poor people's organizations in every major city. And they were mainly organized through a group called the Foundation for Community Development, which was one of the spinoffs of the North Carolina Fund. Howard Fuller, who became Owusu Sadaki and then went back to being Howard Fuller, was like the key, lead Black Power organizer in the state. My good friend and comrade, Jim Lee, who was also a few years ahead of me, was right up there with him. So this was like a set of institutions that was there for young people who were inclined toward political activism to engage themselves with and to develop through. And another one, just to sort of queer the story a little bit, the UNC campus YMCA became a central node of the intake for an age cohort of radicals around the state. because it was run by a woman named Anne Queen, who was an older white woman who had been a mill worker early in life. At some point, there was a significant intervention in her life. She went to Berea College in Kentucky, and then I think was the first woman to graduate from the Yale Divinity School. And she was kind of a social justice, they call her now, oriented person. And she was just a conduit so through her, the Y, like in addition to being a case where every student could get their checks cashed for free, was what was a place that ran programs and like institutions that brought us in. One central one was what was a group called the Youth Educational Services, which was a tutorial project. And that drew me in. It drew in people like Nelson Johnson over at North Carolina A&T and a bunch of others of us from around the state. So
Nelson Johnson from the A&T 4.
Was he from the A&T 4?
Johnson. I'm trying to remember. Maybe not. Maybe he comes right after that.
Yeah.
But we're going to take a pause.
Right. That A&T 4. Yeah. He definitely comes after that.
He comes. Okay. Yeah. No question. But I do want to. We're going to take a break. When we come back, you've kind of led us into, particularly in chapter 3, as you talk about how folks are trying to make sense of themselves. I assume this is the period when you interact with the Lumbee Indians and these categories of race just kind of melt away, and people have to scramble and decide what they're going to do. And class really is beginning to emerge. And you say, like Du Bois says, once these race barriers have fallen, we have the more intractable questions of class. Right. We have more to deal with. We'll be back in a second on the other side of this break with Professor Adolph Reed Jr., his new book, The South. This is The Black Table. Back in a second.
We're all impacted by the culture, whether we know it or not. From politics to music and entertainment, it's a huge part of our lives, and we're going to talk about it every day right here on The Culture with me, Faraji Muhammad, only on the Black Star Network.
Back at the Black Table, Greg Carr, Black Star Network, joined today by Professor Adolph Reed Jr., author of his most recent book, of course, The South. And Professor Reed, you had us in North Carolina when we left, and you really began to narrate how the black-white paradigm begins to melt away in the wake of that legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. And in the 70s, this convergence of different folk, different ideological positions, postures, different races, you really force us to confront the fact that most people will try to do what's in their best interest, and they're just going to use the reality they inherit and the frameworks in which they inherit to try to do that. I mean, they're just navigating in circumstances. I mean, how were your experiences? How should we use them as a way to confront some of this kind of essentializing impulse that we see in today's politics?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, like my dad always said that the greatest general in the world is General Hindsight, right? 'Cause he's never lost a battle. And I got smarter about this stuff as it receded in the historical in the rearview mirror. But yeah, that's what people do. And I mean, Peter Novick, like the historian, in a very powerful book called The Holocaust in American Life, argued against the Goldhagen thesis and like other people who've contended that ordinary Germans bore a responsibility for not doing more to rise up against Hitler. And Novick's point, which I clearly took to heart, is that if you set heroism as individual standing against the tide, right, as a standard for being a just or a decent person, then you've stacked the deck, right, to make everybody horrible, right? Because what most of us do most of the time, all of us do some of the time, is adjust our senses of self, our aspirations, how we view the world in relation to what we understand to be the limits that we come up against. And it's a different point, but I'll say this, like, this is one of the problems with progressive or nominally, well, frankly, the way I've been saying it lately is whatever that formation is that occupies the space that the cultural space that a left would occupy if there were one in the U.S.
And
right?
You stand to the left, really, for all intents and purposes, what are we even talking about?
Yeah, no, nothing. But it's not there, and I think that's something that it would do us well to face up to. But one of the big problems with whatever that amalgam is out there is that being a progressive or a leftist has come much more to be a statement about oneself, about how one sees one's identity, than it is about a pragmatic commitment to transforming the world, right? And like there are a lot of factors that feed into that, like the whole NGOization of the movement, I think, is one of them, certainly, and a big one. But to the extent that that's the case, then that means that people are more committed to an understanding of who they are and what they feel, and seeking, as everyone does, right, to some level, to harmonize. And this is something else my dad often said about ideology. He described it as, in one sense, the mechanism that harmonizes the principles that you want to believe that you hold and what advances your material interest, right? and we all tend to do that. And see, I think among other reasons, that's why it's so important for us to be part of collective processes, because I don't trust myself, right? Like none
of us can, not really.
Well, no.
I mean, without absent some type of group formation. In fact, I want to ask you about that, because you write about why you're in North Carolina, rather, Soul City, Floyd McKissick, and you make an interesting observation that some of the class interaction between whites and blacks, there's more of a comfort level based on class than there is race. And I guess that leads me to a question as it relates to race. And you as an organizer who spent a lot of time organizing, when you say that, for example, black folk really have no obligation of group loyalty, and I'm not going to single out black folk. I don't know if there's any folk who do that.
Right.
Is there anything to be gained in trying to cultivate a sense of group loyalty beyond shared oppression among black folk? And how do we do it for those who are in the working class or the poor?
Right. Well, yeah, that's a good question too. I mean, the group loyalty thing is interesting, right? In this sense, people belong to multiple groups, and see, this is what like the straight race line wants to deny. I mean, from the time that I first encountered Patricia Hill Collins's work in the late '80s, and what was to become later, or not much later, when intersectionality, what struck me was that the account goes like, men have particular experiences as men, women have particular experiences as women, blacks have particular experiences as blacks, et cetera. And I mean, heterosexual people have a particular experiences as heterosexuals. And then in Collins's account, anyway, the punchline becomes, therefore, to understand the situation of a black woman, you got to be a black woman. And my question was always, well, why is that the last stop on the train line, right? I mean, what keeps this way of thinking from going all the way to the radical subjectivist view that no one person can adequately understand the experience of any other one person, because every individual is going to be like a snowflake in that sense.
Yes.
So there's solidarities and solidarities, right? And I mean, race in Barbara Fields' great encapsulation has always been a mechanism of symbolic camouflage or superficial camouflage over political economic dynamics and hierarchies. Like, I'm working on a chapter now where I'm comparing the commitment to white supremacy on the part of the the lost cause ideologues in the late 19th century as a way of, as a means to imposing a ruling class program, right? To our contemporary moment, where on the part of some of the people who want to focus our politics on taking those monuments down. And don't get me wrong, nobody in this world is happier to see them gone than I am. But there are elements out there that want to make that a centerpiece of what we understand Black politics to be all about. And my argument is that those forces are pursuing a racial or a race reductionist understanding of the issue for a different version of the reason that the white supremacists at the end of the 19th century were doing it. Absolutely. And that in both cases, it's to advance a class program.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm dying to ask you this, particularly reading chapter 4 on passing, where you raise this question of group loyalty and obligations or lack thereof and individualism, looking at somebody like Judge Jackson, soon to be Justice Jackson, Ketanji Brown Jackson, married to a white man. You see a lot of Black folks saying, well, she's married to a white man, she isn't loyal to us. But you kind of encourage us to dispose of this notion of racial loyalty that flattens those class distinctions. And I'm wondering whether in a class analysis, she might be considered a passant blanc, in the sense that it's passing more than just phenotype. It's passing also a class phenomenon in the sense, and are we really overburdening that kind of demography based, we've got a Black person on the Supreme Court, are we really overburdening it instead of doing like you and your colleagues were doing and really began doing in the 60s and 70s with the Black politics model? Let's look at our interests. What are our interests? In fact, put a blindfold on and ask the politicians what their interests are. I'm wondering, I mean, is there a passing equivalent in a class?
Right. The passing analogy, like in this respect, is interesting. I'd have to think about it more, but I will say this: that that the race or the demand for race loyalty is often a mask over a class program, right? Like this is an anecdote, of course, it wouldn't make it into the book, but when I moved back to the East Coast from Chicago in the late 90s, I was on a flight back to Chicago for a conference, not long after, and I flew out of Hartford. And a Black woman came into the gate, and she looked familiar, but I thought, like, I'd done a lot of flying the previous couple of years, and I thought that, and I'd begun to recognize flight crews on United, so I thought maybe she was a flight attendant I'd seen before.
Right.
But then I realized she was Gail King, who at that point was an anchor on Channel 3 in Hartford. And it was kind of interesting to watch because her fan base, which was like, white women from 25 to 45, were like gushing, of course, and were all over her. And it was kind of interesting ethnographically to watch her performance of that combined a superficial expression of intimacy and a regal distance at the same time. I thought, wow, that's interesting. But at one point she was explaining, to one of the fans that she was going to Chicago that weekend because that was the opening weekend of Beloved, Oprah's film, right? Based on a Toni Morrison novel. And then she kind of stage whispered to these women that, it's very important for us to see it on the opening weekend because that would help for the rating sweeps. So I sat there thinking, oh, all right. So I didn't realize that we all have an obligation to go make more money for Oprah, who already has more money than God.
Wait a minute, let me, because we will take a break and come back for our final segment. It does remind me of one of your one line that you gave in an interview regarding the 1619 project, where you said, well, I'm wondering whether or not the concern is for the political economy and the radical inequality, or the concern is whether or not to make sure that 12% of the 1% is Black.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
when you say, I mean, and that's a very disturbing kind of thing. But let's take a break. When we come back,
okay.
We got our last section, a last segment with you, Professor Reed. And when we come back, we will finish up for now because as you all can all see, this is an introduction. We've got to have Professor Reed back on so much more of his work. But back in a moment with Adolph Reed Jr., author of The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives at the Black Table on the Black Star Network. It's time to be smart.
Roland Martin's doing this every day.
Oh, no punches!
Thank you, Roland Martin, for always giving voice to the issues.
Look for Roland Martin in the whirlwind, to quote Marcus Garvey again.
The video looks phenomenal, so I'm really excited to see it on my big screen.
Support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
See, there's a difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
I got to defer to the brilliance of Dr. Carr and to the brilliance of the Black Star Network.
I am rolling with Roland all the way.
Honored to be on a show that you own. A black man owns the show.
Folks, Black Star Network is here.
I'm real revolutionary right now. Roland was amazing on there.
Stay black. I love y'all.
I can't commend you enough about this platform that you've created for us to be able to share who we are, what we're doing in the world, and the impact that we're having.
Let's be smart. Bring your eyeballs home.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared. You dig?
We're back at the Black Table for our final segment for now with Professor Adolph Reed. And when we left, we were discussing, among other things, Professor Reed was helping us begin to tease apart some of these class issues that are intraracial often in Black community and that are obscured. Professor Reed, and I didn't mean to cut you off, I wanted to get right into it because I know we had so much more. When you look at contemporary politics, and, you talk about anti-racist work that people are doing and diversity, equity kind of stuff. What are some of the ways that we can draw from our previous experiences and regain maybe some of that momentum of memory from some of the struggles that have been waged in the 60s and 70s and forward, trying to build an analytical framework and organize to kind of replace some of this, I don't even say drift. It just seems like a surge toward this identity politics model.
Right. Well, yeah, that's another really important question, man. And I mean, I think the main thing that we can learn and see generally, and I know that you're asking like a different question. No, generally, but I mean, generally, like when people ask that, what they have in mind is, going like to the Oracle at Delphi and getting some wisdom from Malcolm X or something like that, right?
We know that's not coming.
Right. No. And besides, and this may rankle some people too, but we don't know how Malcolm X would have turned out if he hadn't been murdered, right?
You make that point. In fact, what was somewhere you wrote? I think it was in
Stirrings. Yeah, that's right.
The symbolism of Malcolm is almost worthless in the sense that he just becomes a figure, an avatar, and it just mutes contemporary.
Right, like those X caps, right? The Spike Lee was making money off of in the early 90s.
That well. No question. So there is no Oracle coming then. So what do we do?
Well, see, I mean, this is how I think that it makes sense to approach history in ways to help us try to understand the tasks that confront us in the present. In the last chapter or the conclusion of my Du Bois book, I make an argument for what I call a generative approach to history, or to political history in particular, which comes down to this.
Yes.
That at any given moment, there are a number of forces and ideas and tendencies in contention in a struggle. And the struggles get resolved. They usually, almost all the time, they get resolved in favor of the most powerful elements, right? The ruling class, right? Ultimately. Yes. And the rest of us make accommodations, right? But when moment of struggle, and this is oversimplified, of course, but when a moment of struggle gets resolved into a new common sense, then that becomes the baseline understanding of the nature of things for the next round of struggle, basically. My colleague and good friend Roger Smith has a real nice essay on this called, or has done very nice work on this in a number of places around the theme of the spiral of politics, how ideas, institutions, ideologies, and mobilization emerge, transform, struggle, and become a new consensus. If we understand that that's the way the history works, right, then we can sort of see how for instance, the victories of the mass action, or what I sometimes call the heroic phase of the civil rights movement post-war, that culminated in the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and for that matter, 1968 Fair Housing Act, were victories. The question was on what terms those victories were going to be institutionalized, and who was going to benefit, and what the new regime was going to look like. And I say this, I want the audience to understand that, like, I came into active politics. I came into what's generally called a movement through Black Power, right? I mean, that's right. I mean, that's what, right? I was 19.
The Afro Liberation Support Committee in the Republic of New Africa, brother.
Right.
Get it
exactly. Right. And I know that,
by the way, explaining the situation in Angola to a white race is very complex, man. You crack me up.
Well, I got to tell you, that was a moment. But what wouldn't go in the book is that when I got back to his car, I realized that I had a joint in the cigarette pack that was in my pocket.
Limitations that's run on that property. But the point you're raising, though, I mean, actually, I know we don't have much time left, but I do want to just ask you about this. You said something in the New Yorker interview, which I thought was intriguing. You say, perhaps democracy doesn't survive the midterms,
right?
And of course, you went on to express some hope, but in that context, given what you're saying in terms of building multiracial coalitions that are along class lines, working class movements, I'm wondering, there's a lot of noise around people who would consider themselves on the left to say we shouldn't participate in the two-party electoral system we have in terms of voting today. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that, given what you've just said about inheriting a set of material realities and struggling within those contexts, even as you try to transcend them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I'll just preface by saying, like, I spent more than 15 years of my life trying to build an independent political party, right, anchored in the trade union movement. And I've never really considered myself a Democrat. It's been a marriage of convenience for me as much as it was for them, right? But having said that, see, one of the benefits, and if you don't mind, like, I want to plug my article on this
please.
But it's an article called "The Whole Country is the Reichstag." You can find it at nonsite.org, and the shorter version on Common Dreams. Pardon me?
Common Dreams. Okay. Very good.
And the longer one is in Nonsite. But one of the entailments of facing up to the fact that there is no left is we have no power. We have no capacity to influence anything. And that's why I think it's stupid and a waste of time for people to fall over themselves thinking they have to make comments about Ukraine, because it doesn't matter. And it moreover feeds into, I think, what I think is a definitive American pathology of thinking that we have to comment and pass judgment on whatever goes on everywhere else in the world. That said, the only objective I think there is now, and this notion of getting outside the Democratic Party, to me, is just fanciful, right? Right, because it's not like, so you announce a new party and then people are gonna, like, the masses are disaffected and they'll come and vote for you. That's not the way politics works. The only thing for us to do now, right, the only real objective for leftists, since there is no left, is to do whatever we can to combat the consolidation of authoritarianism or fascism, right? And I would also say that I'm totally fed up with the notion, or with debate among leftists about whether what this movement is in the U.S. and elsewhere counts as fascist, because in my view, that's a parlor game, and and if you're in a situation in which the question seems pertinent, then the only real thing you should be figuring out how to do is how to fight it. But I think that's what the objective is for us now. Yes. And I don't know about the midterms, but I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I feel a little bit more sanguine than I did a few months ago. But between now and 2024, somewhere between an electoral sweep or an out-and-out coup or putsch, I think the danger is quite real.
That's chilling and sobering, and we need to pay particularly close attention to it. And there's so many other things I want to talk to you about, and thank you. We're definitely going to ask you back. And actually, this last question I want to ask really is something that prior to COVID, with all the tragic implications of what has happened during COVID, has kind of opened up a new venue for you, just like so many of us. You have been everywhere, man, in the digital and cyberspace, but you've got a podcast now, huh?
Yes.
Yes. About that as we got to close out.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you mentioned it. Yeah, we have our own podcast called classmatterspodcast.org, and this is like a project of the Debs Jones Douglas Institute, which was created as the educational arm of the Labor Party, and it connects with the work that we've been doing with a small group worker-led trainings on economic crisis and healthcare crisis, and the organizing work that we've been doing in South Carolina and elsewhere within the trade union movement. And the tagline for our podcast is that this is where we consider every episode what the country would look like if it were governed by and for the working class.
Interesting.
And we've got two in the can now, and we're trying to get a third one together, and they're available at the website. The first one is a group of us talking about how to think about what the working class is, and whether what working people have lost faith in government and public goods. The second episode is a discussion with Mark Dimmenstein, who's the president of the American Postal Workers Union, on the centrality of the Postal Service and the dangers of privatization more broadly. And we're trying to get one together now on public education, which we hope will feature a couple of teachers union leaders.
Excellent. This is the important work. And even though you decided to retire from the classroom, it seems like you did that. I know black men can't spell, or women can't spell retire. For all your academic exploits and achievements, it doesn't seem like you learned how to spell that word.
No.
So we want to thank you, Professor Reed, and of course invite you back, and we'll take some time. I really wanted to ask you about reparations, but that's a tease, because we could spend a whole lot of time with that. Folks are talking about it, but I want to ask you about it, and maybe next time we come back. But thank you so much for joining us.
Hey man, thank you so much for having me, and I really enjoyed the discussion, and I'll be ready to come back whenever you want me, if we can work it out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Reed. So
all right, man.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Just make sure. That is our conversation, our initial conversation with Professor Adolph Reed, author of the new book, The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives. Encourage you all to get it. Also to subscribe to his podcast and to follow him across social media platforms. He's been quite busy in helping us try to figure out how to solve some of these real problems that face us today, not only in the United States, but in the world. Back in a moment with a final thought as we clear the black table for the week.
Don't you think it's time to get wealthy? I'm Deborah Owens, America's Wealth Coach, and my new show on the Black Star Network focuses on the things your financial advisor or bank isn't telling you. So watch Get Wealthy on the Black Star Network.
Folks, Black Star Network is here.
I'm real revolutionary right now.
support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America, Roland.
Stay black. I love y'all. All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, this difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home.
You dig?
Welcome back to the Black Table. We're going to close out our conversation with Professor Adolph Reed Jr., one of our most important thinkers, contemporary thinkers, with a quote from him. In fact, this is from his book, his 1997 book, W.E.B. Du Bois and American Political Thought. I encourage you all to get this book, Adolph Reed Jr. At the very end of the book, you heard Professor Reed talking a moment ago about building a different type of politics and political theory grounded in the realities that we face. And he closes his book on Du Bois, speaking about Du Bois, by saying perhaps the key point of connection with Du Bois is his militant and unyielding understanding that the truth is made under constraints and not as its agents choose, but made nonetheless. And the actual boundaries of possibility are knowable only through challenging them. Adolph Reed has lived his life to date as a model of that, exactly that type of work. And we want to learn from him and continue to learn from him and think through how we can make the world we want to live in by confronting the world as it is that we've inherited. So join us again next week at the Black Table. I'm Greg Carr on the Black Star Network, and we're very excited about all of the Black Star Network shows. So join us again for this and the other shows on the network. See you again next week.